conflict and compromise, negotiating the Paris Peace Accords.
The Vietnam War was an expensive war between communism and democracy. The involvement by the United States in Vietnam created conflict. The Paris Peace Accords, a compromise, ended the Vietnam War. While negotiating the accords, conflict between North and South Vietnam over the content successfully ended U.S. involvement. In the post-World War II era, the world became separated, with the Soviet Union leading the communist bloc and the United States leading the free world. The Soviet Union started influencing countries to become communist. In the late 1940s and the early 1950s, the French appealed to the United States for aid while trying to keep Vietnam at bay from the communists. America started its involvement with material supplies to help the French. However, after Dien Bien Phu, the French decided to exit Vietnam. Thereafter, the Soviet Union influenced North Vietnam to become communist. This caused conflict in the country, so the South seceded from the North and the country divided into North and South Vietnam. A war erupted between the two countries. The war was called the Vietnam War. It was also known as the Second Indochina War. While the South wanted democracy, the North wanted to spread communism. With the pretext of containing communist expansion into all of Vietnam, the United States started getting directly involved. Starting with Eisenhower in 1955, the war continued as United States leadership transitioned from president to president, from Dwight Eisenhower to John F. Kennedy, from Kennedy to Lyndon B. Johnson, from Johnson to Richard Nixon. This went from providing war material to advisors to combat troops and eventually negotiations to end the war. By the time the United States entered the war, many of its citizens wanted the United States to get out of Vietnam. In the Vietnam War, there were 58,235 American deaths and people missing in action. Millions of Vietnamese were killed or displaced. In the campaign of Operation Rolling Thunder, the United States dropped 643,000 tons of bombs on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The war caused turmoil on the home front. Anti-war protests became a daily part of life. Americans became divided over the direction of the war. News about the war occupied primetime conversations. This was the first war that Americans could see on television. During Richard Nixon's campaign in 1968, he made a pledge saying,
"I pledge to you, we shall have an honorable end to the war in Vietnam."
His promise is one of the reasons that he won the elections. At the beginning of Nixon's term, he tried to end the war with troops that he already had in Vietnam by increasing bombing campaigns. After about a year of continued protests by the American public for the war to end, he started Vietnamization, in which they would train the local Vietnamese to fight in combat while pulling out U.S. troops. Even with the increased bombing and Vietnamization, the conflict did not end. In order to fulfill his election promise and bring an end to the costly and unpopular war in Vietnam, President Nixon looked to Henry Kissinger as National Security Advisor for help. When negotiations began, North Vietnam appeared to have a winning hand with time on its side. To bring North Vietnam to the table on acceptable terms, Kissinger created a complex negotiations campaign with North Vietnam, the United States, the Soviet Union, South Vietnam, and others. By the December of 1972, North Vietnam, the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam, Democratic Republic of South Vietnam, the United States all agreed to compromise and have a ceasefire until negotiations, removing the biggest roadblock for creation of a treaty. After North Vietnam agreed to work on the treaty, they needed to talk more specific terms. The two countries communicated several times to negotiate the details of the treaty, and one of the letters from President Nixon sent to President Thieu, President Nixon stated the phrase, "the reduction of military on both sides and their demobilization to be accomplished," should be changed to "the reduction of military on both sides and their demobilization to be accomplished as soon as possible." The change was made in order to set a time limit. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed in Paris.
When I heard that the peace accords were going to be signed in Paris, I was happy for the troops and everybody coming home, especially the POWs. And it was pretty much supposed to be a compromise. They were letting the prisoners of war go, and we would stop the bombing of North Vietnam. So that, I was glad it happened.
The accords were effective because they stopped U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The United States had to withdraw all troops within 60 days. All prisoners of war were returned by North Vietnam.
On 21 January 1967, when I became a prisoner of war. This was a rather grim and uncertain existence for me until the Paris Peace Accords were signed in January of 1973. A part of the accords was a requirement to notify those of us who were POWs that the accords had been signed, and this notification was supposed to be done within 5 days of the signing. It is not an understatement to say that I was ecstatic when I was notified. It was clear that I was going home, and this dark period of my life would soon be over.
Though not all of the citizens agreed with the accords, most of the citizens were in favor of ending the war. For America, an exit was necessary. The Paris Peace Accords served that purpose. For South Vietnam, it was time to give peace and elections a try and stop losing innocent lives to the war. While each party had its own interests, for the United States, these accords helped exit the war and hence were successful. The fight between communism and democracy was the main conflict for the war. The compromise of the Paris Peace Accords for the United States resolved the ongoing conflict of U.S. involvement. This resulted in the improvement of economic surge in oil export revenue. Trade and diplomatic ties between Vietnam and the United States resumed around 1990. The United States incurred a massive spending of over $120 billion during the course of the war from 1965 to 1973. Unlike popular belief about the domino theory, the countries surrounding Vietnam did not fall prey to communism. The war had a lasting effect on U.S. foreign policy. Congress passed the Wars Powers Act in 1973 in an attempt to limit presidential powers. As a result of the Vietnam Syndrome, American public turned hostile, and policymakers stayed away from wars in which national interests were unclear.